All right. So, hello everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. In a minute, we'll go into a discussion on nuclear threats, common security, and the possibilities for a nuclear weapon-free world. So we're privileged to have Alyn Ware as our speaker today, and many of you might already know him, but for those that do not, Alyn is WFM's program director. He's also the global coordinator for parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, as well as the Peace and Disarmament Program Director for the World Future Council. He's also the co-founder of various successful campaigns, including Abolition 2000, Move the Nuclear Weapons Money, Unfold Zero, and No First Choose Global. Last, but certainly not least, he's the recipient of numerous awards, including the Right Livelihood Award, also known as the Alternative Nobel Peace Prize. So we're lucky to also have Tadashi Inizuka on the call. So before giving Alyn the floor, I would love if you could say a few opening words, Tadashi, if that's okay with you. And briefly, by way of introduction, Tadashi is one of WFM's co-presidents and the founder of Coalition 3+3, which is one of our projects under the Sustainable Security Without Nuclear Weapons program. And he's also one of our in-house experts on the issue. So over to you, Tadashi.
Thank you, Amy. I'd like to introduce Mr. Alyn Ware to everybody. I'm sure everybody knows him very well, but I have known him over 30 years. First time I met with him was in the city of Nagasaki, and he was he has been still now very active for nuclear weapon abolition activities. And the city of Nagasaki, naturally, we have so many active, people on this issue. And Alyn Ware has been connected with the community so well. And recently, we are trying to push the nuclear weapon-free zone in the Northeast Asia, which is called 3+3, because first 3 means both North and South Korea and Japan, 3 countries, which is a zone country. We are supposed to form a nuclear weapon-free zone in which we don't produce, we don't bring in, we don't let anybody to pass with nuclear weapons, we don't threat or we don't use nuclear weapons. And that means totally nuclear weapon-free zone. And other 3 means surrounding nuclear weapon-free countries, which is US, China, and Russia. And these 3 countries will give this zone a negative security assurance, which means they don't threaten or use the nuclear weapon against this zone. It sounds very idealistic, but come to think of it, NPT started in opening its ratification process in 1968. It's been a while. And 1 year before the NPT started, there was a successful ratification of the Treaty of Tlatelolco, which is nuclear weapon-free zone in South American continent, which is really a great achievement, because this nuclear weapon-free world could start with local, nuclear weapon-free zones. And there are 5 nuclear weapon-free zones, which is South America, South Pacific, and Australia, New Zealand area, and then ASEAN country and the entire continent of Africa, Central Asia. And so naturally, next area would be Northeast Asia. So we are trying to organize with Alyn Ware the like-minded parliamentarians in both South Korea, which is North Korea is at the moment very difficult. So South Korea and Japan, we having exchanges and mutual visits already, and we are planning to visit Washington DC soon with South Korean and Japanese MPs. And Alyn Ware is helping these activities very much. So please wish us good luck, and I will update you as soon as it evolves in a positive way. Thank you.
Thank you, Tadashi. Over to you, Alyn.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you, Tadashi. Just before I start my comments, I'd like to pay a short tribute to a dear colleague who passed away in June this year. That's Dan Ellsberg. Many of you will probably have heard of Dan Ellsberg because he was very brave, having been involved as an intelligence officer in the United States government, and having information about what the United States was doing illegally in Vietnam and in neighboring countries, and released the Pentagon Papers, and as a result, was severely reprimanded, shall we say, in the United States. He was a whistleblower, and then after leaving the government, he, as an intelligence officer for the government, he had been involved in looking at the planning and possible use of nuclear weapons and the various options that the government was exploring in their strategic integrated operational plan. And so he had inside information about what was particularly the United States was planning with regards to launching a nuclear war. So he became a very ardent anti-nuclear activist, involved in a number of events and publishing an incredible book a few years ago about this, and was a great supporter of us, was on the board, advisory board of Citizens for Global Solutions, which is the US affiliate of the World Federalist Movement, and was just a really warm and dear person. And we miss him a lot. So I just wanted to pay a short tribute to this incredible person who passed away earlier this year. So today, what we've described this as a discussion, looking at world federalism, the Doomsday Clock, and the elimination of nuclear weapons, and a process that's going to assist, we hope, with that, which is the UN Summit of the Future. So as a discussion, while I'm giving some introductory comments, if you have any questions which come up as I'm doing the introductory part of this discussion, then please put them in the chat and I might be able to address them as we go along. But I try not to keep the introductory part too long, so there's also time for comments and questions, and a decent discussion. What I'm going to look at is, what is the problem with regards to nuclear risks? What are the reasons for this problem? And then what are solutions that address those reasons? Because if you want to resolve a problem, you sort of have to understand why we have that problem, which is sort of, in a sense, the exploration. It's also where world federalism comes in, and I'll explain that. So with regards to the nuclear risk, I've mentioned the Doomsday Clock, because the Doomsday Clock, which is released, the timing of the Doomsday Clock is released in January of every year by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. The day they do it is normally around the same day, the anniversary of the very first resolution of the United Nations General Assembly, which put forward the aspiration, objective, and even the obligation to achieve a nuclear weapons-free world. So the primary purpose of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock is say, what's the threat to the world from nuclear weapons? That is, what was the first existential threat to humanity and to civilization? Now we have other existential threats that could wipe out civilization, climate change being the top one. So the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists now also looks at some of these other existential threats. But as you may know, because many of you probably followed it in January this year, they put the Doomsday Clock at 90 seconds to midnight, indicating how serious these risks are, nuclear threats and climate change. And the seriousness of the risks of nuclear weapons, of course, been elevated by conflicts, serious conflicts between, involving nuclear armed states. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine and threats of use of nuclear weapons that have emanated out of that, the threats between China and other countries in the Northeast Asian region, and North Korea. North Korea has a nuclear weapons program. China also, there's disputes, not just the one I think Tadashi was mentioning, which is about the status of Korea which is still officially at war, North Korea and South Korea. The war is never officially ended, but also the conflict between China, Japan, China, Philippines, China, Malaysia, in that area, and the United States. There's India, Pakistan. So there's a number of areas where the tensions and direct conflicts involving nuclear armed states could give rise to nuclear war, either by crisis escalation, by miscalculation, by accident, or even intent. So these are the risks of this. With regards to the reasons for this, so I would say, if you have a look, there's an international commission exploring the issue of nuclear weapons, which the foreign ministers of Australia and Japan 10 or 12 years ago, explored this. What are the reasons? Why are the nuclear armed states and nuclear allied states relying on nuclear weapons? They came up with 10 reasons, but I can distill it down to 3, and that is power, security, and money. So if we are wanting to address the reliance on nuclear weapons, we have to look at those key 3 aspects. Just saying nuclear weapons are bad is not going to do it unless we address these reasons. So just unpack this just a little bit. So power, here we see it playing out in a few different ways. The UK, for example, one of the reasons there's very strong adherence to nuclear deterrence by the UK is because they believe it gives them a seat on the Security Council. It gives them more power. One of the reasons why India went nuclear was because they were also vying for a Security Council seat. They were having their push for this was not being picked up at all by the other states. They thought, oh, if we develop nuclear weapons, it'll give us more power in the international arena. We can spend a lot of time talking more about the power, but I'm going through this quickly so we have a lot of time for discussion. Next part is security. And so the states who either have the nuclear weapons or rely on them believe that they provide a deterrent value to deter against aggression against their country. And that deterrence value, in a sense, has been elevated to some degree in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because many of the countries in Europe now that are part of NATO say, well, look, we're part of NATO. We have the nuclear threat against Russia. That's why Russia didn't invade us, but invaded a non-nuclear country. Now, one can say, is that correct or not? But this is the perception. And security is as much as a perception as is a fact. So if countries are perceiving that they are protected by nuclear weapons, we have to address that perception in order to get them to give up the nuclear weapons. And the final one is money, the nuclear arms race. So looking at those 3 key aspects, what are some of the solutions that we can move towards? As I mentioned, just saying that nuclear weapons are bad is not sufficient, and we've seen that. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons basically says that nuclear weapons are bad, they're illegal, and countries should not have them. But none of the nuclear armed states and none of the nuclear allied states have joined that. And so, because it doesn't address the reasons that they have nuclear weapons. But if we have a look at what Tadashi was talking about, a nuclear weapon-free zone, it's a different approach to this, which actually does address one of the key aspects of this, which is the security aspect. Because the difference between, say, a nuclear weapon-free zone and a country, say, joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, is for a nuclear weapon-free zone, it's not unilateral. You're doing it with a group of countries in the region. So the threat to you from other countries is reduced because all the countries in the region are joining. In addition, the threat to your country is reduced because a nuclear weapon-free zone comes with security assurances, where the nuclear weapon states are invited to give assurances that they will respect the zone and that they will not threaten or use nuclear weapons against the zone. So a nuclear weapon-free zone is like a common security approach to lowering or eliminating the role of nuclear weapons in a region. And this more and more the common security approach is where World Federalist Movement and also the partner organizations are coming in and saying, like, this is how we can address that particular issue that the nuclear armed states and the allied states have for holding on to their nuclear weapons. If they believe it provides security, we can provide that security in different ways, in better ways. And what are those ways? Well, they're basically identified in the UN Charter. The UN Charter first puts down the legal obligation to refrain from the threat or use of force in international relations and the obligation to resolve international conflicts in peaceful ways. And that's in Article 2. And in Article 33, the UN Charter lays out how you do that. And so it lays out the negotiation, conciliation, mediation, arbitration, adjudication, use of courts, use of tribunals, use of regional bodies, and other peaceful means. So the common security framework is a way that the security is achieved not through the threat or use of force, which is actually illegal under international law, not through building up militaries, not through nuclear weapons, but resolving conflicts and applying the law. And I say both, they're both really important. The conflict resolutions, because there are actually good mechanisms for doing that, and they have proven to be successful, but also the application of the law. And this is really important because you may have, you know, in a conflict situation, a very powerful country that believes, well, it doesn't have to enter into or go into the International Court of Justice. So for the International Court of Justice so far, only 73 of the UN member states have actually accepted the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice for all legal disputes between them and other countries. Some have kept out, believing we don't need to do that, maybe because we're more militarily stronger or got more power. So when there is that situation, sometimes you can still use the court. And you can do it, for example, a number of treaties have got ways of taking cases to the court. The Genocide Convention, for example, has got that in there. So Ukraine has actually taken Russia to the International Court of Justice over this allegations that Ukraine were conducting genocide in the Donbas region, even though Russia doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the court for all legal conflicts that they may have with other countries. So there are other ways to take powerful countries to the International Court of Justice, even if they are at the moment have refrained from accepting the compulsory jurisdiction of it. But an objective, and this is an objective that we're bringing in both with World Federalist Movement, but also with a new project called Law Not War, is to elevate not just how the court can be used when you've got power differences between, you know, less powerful countries and more powerful countries, and there are a lot of examples of the court working very well in that situation. New Zealand taking France to the International Court of Justice over nuclear testing, for example. Nicaragua taking the United States to court when the United States was providing military support for the revolution against Nicaragua. These are cases where less powerful countries have taken more powerful countries to the court and basically won. And this has helped to restrain and change the aggressive behavior of the more powerful countries. But the other key thing to think about in this is not always just about balancing the power or applying the law, but it's also about resolving the conflicts. And again, that's where the International Court of Justice is one mechanism. There are others. I mentioned mediation, arbitration, also as other possibilities. But the court is a key one, because when a case is taken to the court, it's not just a political decision. In fact, it's not a political decision. It's not weighing up, you know, the countries lobbying other countries to vote for their support, for example, in the UN General Assembly, or exerting their power in the Security Council with a veto power, because the court, International Court of Justice, is not countries that sit on the court as the judges, they're individual judges. So there's no lobbying of countries. That can't really happen. There's really not even the lobbying of the judges, because it's not really feasible to do that. So it takes it totally out of the political power realm and into the realm of historical aspects and facts for the case and the application of the law. So this is one reason why we're elevating that. It's not the only mechanism, as I mentioned. There are other mechanisms important. We also need to look at reforming the Security Council, and the fact that under the initiative of Liechtenstein, the UN General Assembly can now take action on a critical issue if that issue is blocked in the Security Council. So elevating these processes for application of law, resolving conflicts peacefully, this can help then build the confidence in common security, that common security and work, and so we can relinquish the reliance on nuclear deterrence. Now, most countries of the world have already relinquished reliance, but there's still a sizable, not just number, but countries that are very powerful. So working with these countries is a little bit of like, carrot and stick approach. We have to push hard on the legal obligations not to use nuclear weapons, the legal obligations to work for the elimination of nuclear weapons, but we also have to enter into dialogue and discussion with these countries about how they can meet their security needs without relying on nuclear weapons through common security mechanisms. And we've mentioned a few of those today. On the website unfoldzero.org, we have a section on common security, which goes through the common security framework in more details. So that's useful to have a look at. Also, as I mentioned, we've got a new project called Law Not War, and you can also find the link on the Unfold Zero website and on WFM, World Federalist Movement IGP website under our programs page. You can also find the links to this, the Law Not War program. And this one, we are specifically looking at the role of the International Court of Justice, encouraging greater use of the International Court of Justice and encouraging greater acceptance of the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. As Tadashi mentioned, we're also advancing nuclear weapon-free zones. And the final part I mentioned, which is the money side, which is important because another key reason, particularly in the United States and the UK, not so much in Russia and China, to some degree, but not so much in France, but particularly the United States and the UK, the nuclear weapons industry has got an incredibly powerful influence. And even when there are initiatives, for example, when President Obama was putting forward nuclear disarmament initiatives, he was being held back by the US Congress because many of the congressional members, and not just Republicans, also some of the Democrats, were getting money in their districts from the nuclear weapons industry. And so they were voting against initiatives for nuclear disarmament or only supporting, for example, only supporting the New START, ratifying the New START agreement, if the US government would spend more money on nuclear weapons and produce new nuclear weapons. So the nuclear weapons industry is another area where we have to really work for. And yes, Michael, I see that you're asking for the link. So I see Amy's already put one in. I'll put some more in also just as soon as I finish talking. The other aspect, on the nuclear weapons industry is that something we can address not only in the nuclear weapon states. In the nuclear weapon states, the role of legislators is of primary importance because the legislators vote on budgets. So they can actually stop the budgets that are going to particularly nuclear weapons programs. And we're doing a lot of that in the United States with the co-president of my organization, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, my other organization. Senator Markey is the co-president, is putting a number of initiatives in the US Congress, in the Senate, to cut the funding for various nuclear weapons programs, but it's hard to get majority support for those, but some are moving ahead. But also in the non-nuclear countries, what we can do is end the investments in the nuclear weapons industry. These investments come in many different ways, in government funds like sovereign wealth funds and pension funds, in university funds, in banks, in our own investments. And so we have a global campaign on both cutting the nuclear weapons budgets, ending investments in the nuclear weapons industry, and refocusing those budgets and investments on peace, on common security, on sustainable development, on climate protection, on health, the things that we need that will actually help also with common and human security. So I'll also put the link to that in soon, which is the nuclearweaponsmoney.org. And I see in the chat already we have the links to unfoldzero.org, and the 3+3 is the proposal that Tadashi was talking about for a Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone. So that's probably about enough for the introduction about the solutions, some of the programs, but just to mention a little bit about the platforms that are provided through the United Nations, because we all know that the United Nations has problems in implementing some of these areas because of the power and powerful countries, but there are also big possibilities to advances through the United Nations, various platforms, and so we need to utilize those. We can succeed. For example, I was involved in taking a case to the International Court of Justice to challenge the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. To get to the International Court of Justice, we had to go through the United Nations. we had to get the United Nations General Assembly to adopt a resolution to do this. We were able to do this, even with the powerful countries trying to stop us. So the United States, France, the UK, Russia, China, a number of the NATO countries were all trying to stop us. They're trying to lobby the other countries, but we managed to build a majority enough to get the General Assembly to adopt the resolution to take the case to the court. And that decision of the court has been really influential, because that decision laid down the fact that the current existing international law, the laws of warfare, the laws of peace and security, in general prohibit the threat or use of nuclear weapons and require progress towards their elimination. So that's provided a strong constraining or restraining factor on the nuclear weapon states. And maybe it's one of the reasons that the conflicts haven't yet gone into, escalated into nuclear war. But in order to ensure that they don't, we have to move towards the elimination side. So we can use the UN. I've just mentioned the General Assembly. We're also very active in the UN Human Rights Council, because since 2018, where the UN Human Rights Committee affirmed that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would violate the right to life, we can go into the Human Rights Council and challenge the nuclear weapon states and the allied states when the time comes up for the review of their implementation of the human rights obligations. So these are just a couple of ways we can take forward in the UN. But a key one which is coming up, which we mentioned, is the Summit of the Future, which is happening in September 2024. There's already a big preparatory process for this. Governments are meeting and discussing what are we going to talk about at the summit. They've just adopted the modalities resolution 2 weeks ago. Civil society are coming together. The Coalition for the UN We Need, which we're part of, brought together over 2,000 people to input, some in person, many online around the world, to input ideas and proposals to take to the UN Summit of the Future. So this is providing a big opportunity. There are proposals to the UN Summit to lay down an aspirational commitment to the elimination of nuclear weapons no later than 2045, a call on all nuclear weapon states to adopt no first use policies, to never launch a nuclear war, and there's some other proposals sort of going there also, including the one on elevating the role of the International Court of Justice and on common security. So we have great opportunities working through the United Nations and the Summit of the Future. So I'll wrap up there. I see there's a couple of comments already coming in the chat. I think that we've got the capacity, Amy, that people can even speak and ask some of their questions or make comments. Is that correct in this discussion time?
Yes, absolutely. So would you like us to move into Q&A?
Certainly, yeah. And then I'll also put in, we see on nuclearweaponsmoney.org is in the chat. Thank you very much for putting that in. So we do have the links in the chat already to some of those programs.
Okay, so thank you for your reflections, Alyn. First of all, something alarming that I've picked up on that you've talked about is the motivations of countries such as India. So if that's not a critique on the current international system, then I don't know what is. So you might put your questions in the chat, or you can raise your electronic or flash hand. But first, I would love to know if Tadashi or Rebecca have any immediate questions for you, as we wait for everyone else to gather their thoughts. Chris, did you have a question? Or Tadashi, do you want to say something?
Tadashi, go first.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to share with you that what is going on in Tokyo right now is all the news, all the talkings in the town. It seems to me that they are against North Korea, China, and Russia, and it's really one-sided. And I feel, and many of us feel, really this is unusual, because there's no small voice talking about shared security, for instance, Alyn was suggesting, which means dialogue. But we only hear the pressure side. And I think this is really the moment that we have to act towards the dialogue. That's my comment. Thank you.
Alyn, do you want to respond to that?
First, just to Michael, who asked for the links about the common security and how to meet security needs in common security way. I put in the common security link in there. Also, I will put in very soon the law, not war, because that's very much related to it. And the common security link there outlines common security mechanisms and organizations. The United Nations is not the only one. There's also the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, for example, is another common security organization. Also, I had mentioned the nuclear risk reduction and working for a commitment to never launch a nuclear war. So I've put in the link to No First Use Global, which is working mostly on that. And they have the the Declaration of Public Conscience, which No First Use Global has been advancing. Got 1,100 endorses so far, and that is the one which is affirming the statement that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, and so moving the governments to adopt policies never to launch a nuclear war, and particularly no first use policies. So the no first use one is in there. With regards to Tadashi's comment, here again is where the process for the Summit of the Future, I think, is really helping to broaden the discussion of nuclear disarmament, nuclear risk reduction, and the elimination of nuclear weapons to a bigger audience, and to elevate it also in the discussions in the governments. Because in the UN system as a whole, and even in politics in general, nuclear disarmament doesn't get like a big place in the discussions, and other issues, sustainable development, human rights, climate change, capture much bigger spaces, much bigger audiences, a lot more political attention, and the ideas for nuclear disarmament and the elimination of nuclear weapons is very small. What political attention is given to the nuclear weapons issue is often a very discriminatory approach. It's one that doesn't really pay much attention to the nuclear weapons of the big, powerful countries, but says, oh, when North Korea does a missile, it's huge, missile launch, for example, that's huge news. Or if Iran blocks the inspectors from coming to the nuclear facilities, that's big news. It's like, blaming the smaller countries rather than the big ones for the ones who have all the nuclear weapons. So again, what we're trying to do is broaden the discussion, so it's not just against the few smaller countries that might be either nuclear weapon states or possible having the risks of becoming nuclear weapon states, but the ones who have the biggest piece of the nuclear weapons pie, that are playing the most important role in this. And that in particular is the United States and Russia. They are the ones with the biggest arsenals. They are the ones who have got the most stringent nuclear weapons development programs. So particularly we have to move with them. But as I've mentioned, we're broadening the debate out is very important, and we're having some success with that through, in particular, the preparations for the Summit of the Future, which the civil society players coming in to engage in the Summit of the Future with human rights organizations, civil rights, environmental organizations, and development organizations. And they are now seeing, oh yes, peace, the prevention of war, the elimination of nuclear weapons, ending of nuclear threats, these are all really relevant to the other issues. And so we're building a lot more cooperation, particularly amongst the civil society, and we're starting to try to move the governments to start thinking out of their silo boxes also. And so at the NPT PrepCom, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, in August, we were encouraging the diplomats who are from the governments who are mostly just focusing on the NPT process, when they get back to Geneva, to go and participate in the human rights, the UPR, the Universal Peer Review process. So move from the disarmament room where the discussions are over to the human rights room. And then go, oh, actually, that's really interesting. We hadn't thought about that. So broadening our framework is really helping, and we're starting to get some traction on that. See a couple of hands. So let's go to a couple of hands, and then while they're talking, I'll also have a look in the chat box.
Great. I know that Chris Hamer had a question. So before we come to Balkrishna and Rebecca, Chris, maybe you want to ask your question?
Okay, thanks, Amy. Well, first, I'd like to congratulate Alyn and Tadashi and encourage them to keep going. Nuclear weapons are certainly perhaps the most crucial danger we face. If they were actually used, we'd be in danger of even losing civilization. And the way out, we all recognize, is to establish a world federation with a system of binding international law and common security, which is what Alyn's been talking about. But things are very difficult at the moment, right? We're in a time of war. We've seen the actual threat of use of nuclear weapons by Russia. North Korea, how we get them to join the 3+3, I don't know. Well, Kim is there. They've just apparently built their own nuclear submarine. So the times are very difficult, not to say impossible. So the theoretical question I have is, I suppose, have we got it the wrong way around? Do we need to get World Federation first, and then we will have a system of binding law and common security and be able to get rid of these weapons finally? Until then, I'm afraid the great powers will demand to retain their deterrent. I guess that's the gist of my question, if they'd like to attack that one.
Yeah, I can address that. I think these are mutual tracks. One is, of course, we need global governance. I mean, it seems to be illogical that at the national level, if a crime is committed, then that criminal, can be arrested, or the suspect taken to court, and they don't have the option of not being arrested and taken to court. They can't say, oh, I don't accept the jurisdiction of the court, so I'm free to do whatever I want. At the international level, we sort of seem to have that. We've set up an international court of justice, but it's not compulsory. So countries basically have the choice. Are we going to adhere, to legal obligations which would be defined by the International Court of Justice? So I agree that we need to move towards something where international law is binding, and that would include compulsory jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. Also, a form of establishing the law which is more participatory. At the moment, we have international law is basically developed through government negotiations and adoption of treaties. That's not the only thing. There's also the development of customary international law and a whole normative process, and civil society is engaged in that process. But we don't have, like in most countries, a parliament where you have legislators who are elected and they have to operate on behalf of their constituencies, or they don't get re-elected next time. There's also options in the parliamentary process to develop the law and adopt the legislation. There is civil society engagement in that. We don't really have that at the international level. And we don't have an international parliament that we vote that builds the international law. So these are proposals of the World Federalist Movement, for example, to have the proper governance levels at the international level that will deal with the issues that require the global governance. The issues that require national governance will remain with the national level. Those that are local governance will rest at that, but for the international ones. But I would not say we need to wait for that, because if we wait for that, the planet could be destroyed before we get there. And we have these existential threats of nuclear weapons, of climate change. We have human rights violations and civil rights violations, which are happening now. And we can't wait for a perfect world or a much better world in order to address these. We have to do what we can using the mechanisms that are available, and use those mechanisms better than we do, or more often than we do, because these mechanisms can work. Not all the time, but if they're working a lot of the time, then let's not throw that out. Let's use them. And that's what we're demonstrating, that with the International Court of Justice, even though we don't yet have universal jurisdiction, we still have so many ways that we can take cases to the court. We took nuclear weapons to the court through the advisory opinion approach of the UN General Assembly. Ukraine has taken Russia to the court, over these genocide allegations through the Genocide Convention. So we have advisory opinion approach through the General Assembly. We can get to the court. We have in treaties the possibility of that, and we have the acceptance of jurisdiction of the court. So we can use these mechanisms now. We can use the General Assembly. It's not perfect, but we can use it effectively. We can use the human rights bodies in Geneva effectively to challenge and make a difference to the human rights application of human rights to government behaviour within their countries as well. So I would say to Chris, yes, let's put forward the goal. We do that. That's what World Federalist Movement is doing. We want to achieve that. It's not just fantasy. It is possible to move to a better world, but in the meantime, we use and strengthen the existing processes that we have.
Balkrishna? No, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Regarding, I will be talking of the South Asian regions. At present, there are 3 nuclear weapon flashpoints: North Korea, Ukraine, and India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, India and Pakistan do not have good relation. India and Pakistan fought near about 4 wars, and both are nuclear weapon states. People from all start of life, like even defense personnel, I have talked with some generals, lieutenant generals, ordinary people, minister, parliamentarians. They are not aware of the horrible impact of the nuclear weapons. Sometimes our political leaders, they say, nuke Pakistan. Same thing I have heard in United Nations meeting. Pakistani diplomats say, we'll nuke Pakistan. Sorry, we'll nuke India. Pakistan's Prime Minister, Defense Minister, they threat that they will nuke India. Because public are not aware of the horrible impact of the nuclear weapons. Public campaign to educate the people regarding what the nuclear weapon is, horrible impact. It is a duty of all NGOs that we have done. Hibakusha Association of Japan, Atomic Bomb Victim Association of Japan, and Hiroshima Peace Museum, they donated us the Hiroshima Nagasaki atomic bombing photos. And we created the No More Hiroshima, No More Nagasaki peace exhibition in India. And we took this peace exhibition in all over India. Whosoever will see the photos of nuclear bombing of the Hiroshima, Nagasaki, he will say there should not be nuclear war. Public education awareness is a must in all parts of the world. I visited many European countries. In America, the ordinary people on the street, they are not aware what are the horrible impact of the nuclear weapons. If we want to gain the nuclear weapon state, we have to do the public education and awareness campaign. In my country, the intellectuals, so-called intellectuals sitting in the table and discussing this issue, we have to go to the people. Same thing may be in all European countries, every country. We are not going to the people. Public education awareness is a must. If we want to come our goal, nuclear weapon free world, because now the International Physician for Prevention of Nuclear War, they have done the research. In the limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan, and if they will use only 50 nuclear weapons, 2 billion people will be affected, and 1 billion people of global south, they will die due to starvation. We have to take the message to the people, not sitting in the air-conditioned room, not sitting with the diplomat, not sitting with our safe place and discussing on this issue. Without the public education awareness, I'm not sure that we can achieve the goal. So as I'm working from the grassroots, the national, international level, I have seen many international organizations, even they are not doing any public education work from the grassroots. They are only discussing on the higher level. Until and unless public education awareness from the grassroots level all over the world, we cannot achieve the nuclear weapon free world. This is my opinion, what I have seen in my life, all in my country. In Pakistan, I visited Pakistan. I visited near about 136 countries in the Europe. So I have seen all over the world, people are not aware. Ordinary people are not aware of the horrible impact of the nuclear weapons. So without discussing in the room, we have to go to the people. And being a democratic in my country, when there is a public campaign, public demand, we achieve the rule. I will cite one example. Due to the international campaign to ban landmines, due to the public campaign, 164 countries signed the ban treaty. They will not use, they will not produce, they will not export the anti-personnel landmines. If we can bring the strong public campaign, certainly government has to work. This is my frank opinion as I am working on grassroots level. I have seen the grassroots problem. I am also working with the ministers, parliamentarians, the defense personnel. So without doing the public education awareness campaign, I'm not optimistic that this nuclear weapon-free world, our dream will become true. Thank you very much.
Alyn, before you respond to that, I see a related question in the chat. So Gray South On asks, how relevant is public education and mobilization through the many NGO organizations that could be engaged? So as you answer, think of those two comments.
Okay, well, firstly, I'll thank both Dr. Kirby and also Gray Southern for the incredible work that each of you are doing on peace and disarmament education. I know I've seen some of the work of both of you. Gray Southern's been working with a lot of students, with Model UNs, with the United Nations Association, also with a number of organising events. And Dr. Kirby, we've heard a little bit about the work that you've been doing as well, which is really important. So commendations to both of you. Education is a huge enterprise. There is a lot of work to be done at multiple levels, in schools, in universities, in internet and organizations that people are gathering in, whether that be service clubs like, Rotary clubs is a good place to take forward, other organizations out in the street. There are so many areas where we can take education forward. No one of us can do everything, but we can all contribute something. What I was doing before I was in the international stage was working primarily to bring peace education into the schools in New Zealand, my country, and doing that both by teaching classes on peace and disarmament education, but also moving the government, the Ministry of Education, to adopt peace studies as part of the curriculum. And we managed to get that. So now we have a much greater capacity to have these topics taught in kindergartens even. We start in kindergarten, primary and secondary schools on conflict resolution, peace, how peace in the home and the school relates with peace in the community and the world, issues of nuclear disarmament, particularly on the key days. So the key days, and I mention the key days because that's also an opportunity to do education events. The International Day Against Nuclear Tests, which is August the 29th, the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, which is September 26th. So both of those dates have been recognized by the United Nations by consensus, which means you can even have government support. Well, you should be able to get at least government support, maybe not financial support, but other political support for events which are highlighting those days, because all governments supported the establishment of those days. And there's also, of course, Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day that hasn't been recognized by the UN, but it's recognized globally. And in New Zealand, our Schools Peace Week covers Hiroshima and Nagasaki days. It works for us because we're in the Southern Hemisphere. So August is winter, it's not summer. Those days wouldn't work in schools in the Northern Hemisphere because they're on holidays. But using these international days is a way of doing special education efforts, whether they're in schools or whether they're in the community. That's important to use those. Also, for those special days, particularly, the International Day Against Nuclear Testing, there are key UN events, which can also, some of them are on UN TV. So there's also a way of indicating that what you may be doing in your local community or in your school is also being replicated to some degree with education events at the high level, at the United Nations. On September 26th, the International Day for the Total Elimination of Nuclear Weapons, it will really be high level because that is in the high level week. So for that particular high level event, there are prime ministers, presidents, foreign ministers, and then some ambassadors speaking in the special high-level meeting on the elimination of nuclear weapons at the UN. You can watch it live. It'll also be recorded, so that can be a useful tool to use in your own education efforts, or your own events, to indicate that it's not just us doing it in our community, but it's happening all over the world. We can have a whole session on other ways. A key thing with the peace education in schools is that it can sometimes be hard, particularly if you're not an educator. I had an advantage because I was trained as a teacher, so I had credentials to be able to get into the schools. But what helped us was the United Nations also adopted a report, and again, it was by consensus. So all the governments accepted the report on education for non-proliferation and disarmament. Actually, it extended to peace education. They just didn't use it in the title. So that report has basically got the credibility that all governments have agreed to it, and includes, the commitment to bringing peace education and non-proliferation and disarmament education into schools. So if you're working with, encouraging your ministry or Department of Education, whether it's national or whether it's done state by state, to bring in disarmament and non-proliferation education to the schools, you've got credibility and authority because your government's agreed to it at the United Nations, and you can cite the report, for example. That's just a few comments on that. It's a huge, big topic. It's so important because we have to counter, the opposite, which is education, or media and publicity on nationalism, on violence, and that's prevalent, particularly in social media. And we don't have the time today. The whole area, how to better use social media on education, is also really, really important. But I really don't have time to touch on that topic.
Rebecca?
Thank you. Well, let me preface this by saying I didn't anticipate intervening at this session, but since Amy invoked me, I will do so. And I think this follows on Dr. Kirby and Mr. Southern's comments a bit. So the threat of nuclear holocaust was in many ways the animating principle and crucible through which both of our organizations, WFM-IGP and Citizens for Global Solutions, then World Federalist Association, were formed. And at that moment, it was a threat that was very much seized by the common imagination. And in some ways, in subsequent decades, has not been forgotten by anybody in this proverbial room, but has been forgotten in the popular imagination. And Alyn has talked about some ways that we can capitalize on UN days. We can capitalize on milestones in my country. This year is the 70th anniversary of President Kennedy's signing of the partial nuclear test ban treaty, or even pop culture moments. But to take, for example, the framing device of this session, the Doomsday Clock, one of the criticisms of that particular tactic has been that it incites a sort of apocalypse paralysis, that you cannot scare the humanity into rationality. Coupled with this, now I would say that we have kind of a cacophony of catastrophes, from pandemics to climate crises. And we see this at the Summit of the Future, with all the competing priorities trying to get oxygen and space and voice in the room. So I guess my question to Alyn is, how do we seize the opportunity of the Summit of the Future and intersectionality of these supposedly competing priorities to come out with something that's more than just an inflection point for pop culture or an animating point for activists, and it really is a tipping point in terms of policy change?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. And I think we've seen an attempt at this, which I think is quite a good attempt, but it's still ongoing, initiated by Coalition for the UN We Need. And just to give you a bit of where that came from, the Coalition for the UN We Need brought together a huge number of civil society organizations for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. And then after that, that morphed into an ongoing coalition of non-governmental organizations that is across the spectrum of the different topics that Rebecca was mentioning are feeding into the Summit of the Future. So what the Coalition for the UN We Need has been doing through Global Futures Forum, through consultations, both thematic consultations and regional consultations, is to try to bring some cooperation between the NGOs, civil society organizations, and others, parliamentarians and other constituents that are working on particular issues, and to see how they relate with other issues, and to build cooperation and to come forward with a common platform, which won't have everything in it, but at least have a lot, will cover the spectrum. So this platform that they've brought to being, it's in an interim stage at the moment, is called the People's Pact for the Future. And it has 33 recommendations and campaigns, in a sense, that have come out of this consultation process. And this is now something which we can use. So in there are, for example, 5 proposals on peace and security. The other ones, my organizations, we are most interested, the environment ones as well, but on those peace and security ones, we can take these forward. But when we go to the government and say, like, here are the proposals on the peace and security, and they are related to these other proposals that are in this pact, and this pact has got broad support from civil society. So we're going in a much stronger capacity, because we've got a much bigger body of civil society with us when we're advancing our peace and security ones. And similarly, when some of the other ones are taking forward the proposals, campaigns in the pact on the environmental side or on the digital compact side, they can also say, look, and we've got the support of a much bigger body of civil society and engagement in these. So that will be, I think, in a sense, in preparation for some of the future, I would say, participate in the Coalition for the UN We Need process. There will be another Global Futures Forum. It's not finalized yet, but it's been planned for Nairobi in Kenya in May, but it hasn't been finalized. And you can find all this on Coalition for the UN We Need website.
I see someone just asked where they can find that document. So I'll just place it in the chat, but do we have any more questions, comments, thoughts? Alyn, would you like to share some closing thoughts? I'll help you with the link.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That was what I was looking for. A Coalition for the UN We Need. And thank you, Amy, for, there we are, have putting the People's Pact into the chat. I want to thank everybody for joining us. This was sort of quite a broad spectrum discussion, but it's because this broad spectrum is important for taking forward these issues. More and more we see the interconnection between human rights, civil rights, environmental issues, peace and security. And while we may have a particular focus on one or other of those, to see the connections, with the other ones, and to engage with others in a cooperative basis is what I think is going to build success. We have, a tough order. There are powerful political interests that are pushing nationalism, that are pushing militarism, that are invested in the fossil fuel economy. But we have the power of people. We have the power of vision. And I would agree with Rebecca that it's better, while we can reflect and indicate the risks, and the Doomsday Clock does that, what's more empowering for people is coming with solutions. And policies that work. And in that, in working with the parliamentarians who are so important in turning visions and proposals into actual policies and legislation, we may be small in our network of legislators. Tadashi joined our network of parliamentarians on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament, and brought a small group of parliamentarians together that he's going to bring over to Washington. But we feed into bigger networks of parliamentarians, including the Inter-Parliamentary Union, for example, which is 178 parliaments of the world participating. And normally at their assemblies, they're like 500 to 600 parliamentarians. So by us participating there, we get to take our proposals into the bigger audience, and we can have more effect. Also with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, we are there putting forward our proposals. So I would say to everyone, when you contributing and participating in this, don't despair that you're only one person. You can feed into much bigger processes. and have an effect. And that's what we're trying to do also with the World Federalist Movement and with PND, our network of parliamentarians, is to ensure that the policies that we're bringing forward, and with the Coalition for the UN We Need, those policies can have effect by bringing them into processes where there is a possibility of making a difference. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Amy, for chairing this, for Tadashi for introducing, Rebecca for joining us. We have another session of this for another part of the world later on today. And I know Rebecca's going to be joining that again, as is Amy. And I look forward to any of your thoughts, comments, and engagement, participation in these initiatives.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Alyn. I can't speak for everyone else, but I've personally learned a lot, so thank you. So that brings us to the end of our time. I'd like to thank you all for your presence and your engagement. So please be on the lookout for future events. As Alyn mentioned, there'll be another session of this later today at 4 p.m. UTC. But you can also check out our website and subscribe to our bulletin so that you can learn more about what we have coming up. So you can visit WFM-IGP.org. And thank you all. Yeah, have a lovely weekend, everyone.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Alyn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you just put that last link in the chat box that you just said? That last where to visit? Oh, thank you.
Great.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Bye.